we can probably get started. We'll make sure whoever comes into the room is let in. We have a small and mighty group today, so we're super excited. Thank you for zooming in today with us on behalf of the Sandbox Center. Happy Zero Emissions Day and welcome to today's session, Becoming Carbon Neutral, featuring partners Barriston Law and Carbonzero. For those who haven't been acquainted with the Sandbox Center or myself, my name is Mackenzie, creative lead for Sandbox. We're located downtown Barrie and online to connect people and their ideas to business resources so that they can create a better life through business. Sandbox is proud to acknowledge that we are positioned on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, which include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We also acknowledge the Wendat Nation, who occupied these lands prior to the middle of the 17th century. So we're committed to educating ourselves and our community on the importance of honoring the first occupancy of this land while supporting the actionable steps towards reconciliation. So what better day to learn about how your business can contribute to the sustainability of our future than Zero Emissions Day? Now more than ever, businesses and communities are transforming the way they function to address climate-related risks, and it's definitely more achievable to become carbon neutral than you'd assume. So what does it mean to be carbon neutral? That's the hot topic of the day, and we're so excited to have Carbonzero, along with Sandbox partners, Barriston Law, shine a light on the importance of offsetting our emissions and what local organizations like Barriston is doing to become carbon neutral, which is super exciting to hear about. So if you have any questions that pop across your mind during this session, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to answer them towards the end of the session. So without further ado, thank you so much to our partners, Barriston Law, for supporting with the delivery of today's session. I'd like to introduce Jacqueline Tuckey of Barriston Law to get us started. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Thanks, Mackenzie, and thanks everyone for joining us. Hi, my name is Jacqueline. I am a civil litigator with Barriston Law. I am joined by Nadine Finbo, who is a family lawyer at Barriston, and by Heather, Liam, and Dan of Carbonzero. So we're really excited about today's session. First of all, as Mackenzie said, it is Zero Emissions Day today. So that came from Nova Scotia. It started September 21st, 2008, and the idea was essentially to give the world a break from fossil fuels and to raise awareness with regard to our emissions and the impacts of those emissions. So what better day than today to announce that Barriston has officially achieved carbon neutrality under the Carbonzero certification program. This is something that we're really excited about. It's been a project we've been working on with Carbonzero for a while now, and we're lucky enough to have Carbonzero here with us today to talk a little bit more about what that means. Essentially, we've been working with Carbonzero to offset our emissions so that we can reduce our carbon footprint as a firm, which is something that we're really excited about, not only because it felt like the right thing to do, but also for those of you who are familiar with Barriston, you may be aware that we are a certified B Corporation. This means that we are held to the highest standards of verified social and environmental performance, public transparency, and legal accountability. So essentially, being a B Corporation means balancing profit and purpose. This was something that, at the forefront of the profit purpose balance is employee engagement and client satisfaction. These are things that are really important to us. We want to make sure that our employees are valued, that they feel their work is fulfilling, and that our clients are happy with the services we're providing. We have found that increasingly this means green practices. These are things that are taken into consideration by employees who want to feel that the place that they're putting in a lot of their time and work and efforts values the environment, values moving forward toward a green society, and clients are also feeling that this is important. So the way that some individuals will go to the grocery store and will shop for products that are sustainably produced, a lot of clients are looking for the same thing in the provision of their legal services. So we're happy to be able to provide legal services in a carbon neutral way. This is something that we're really excited about. And some of our individuals at the firm have even gotten to the point that they're considering residential carbon neutrality within their own homes. So it's something that is spreading and that we're thrilled to share with the community. So this is what started Barriston on its journey. And now I will turn it over to Heather Carrison of Carbonzero to tell you more about the specifics of Barriston's journey with Carbonzero.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Heather. I'm the communications lead at Carbonzero. I'm going to be walking you through most of the rest of the presentation and explaining a little bit about Carbonzero, what we do, and what it means to be carbon neutral, and within that, what Barriston has actually accomplished. So thank you for the intro to Jacqueline and Mackenzie. So when we talk about Carbonzero is Canada's leading offset provider and advisor. In business since 2006, so we've been around for about 15 years, and there's two major sides to our business. So we have our advisory services team, which is headed up by Liam. This supports clients on greenhouse gas measurement projects. So that's everything from the greenhouse gas inventories, life cycle assessments of products, custom research projects, or custom measurement tools, anything under that realm. And then we also have the project developing and sourcing side of our business. That's headed up by Dan, and that supports the development and sourcing of carbon offset projects for our clients that are making carbon neutral claims. So I'll explain a bit more as we go through the presentation how this all plays in together, but that aspect of our business involves sourcing of both Canadian and international projects, designing portfolios of offsets for our clients, project identification, feasibility, and implementation. So what does it mean to become carbon neutral? That's the big topic of the day. Barriston has now accomplished this. So how does a business become carbon neutral? There are three key steps to become a carbon neutral business. So essentially, first, we have to measure our greenhouse gas emissions. If we don't know how much we're emitting now, it's going to be pretty difficult to lower those emissions and then offset them. So we need to know how much we're emitting by completing a greenhouse gas inventory. This can either be, as Barriston has done, a complete corporate inventory that includes the whole business, or some businesses choose to start with a specific aspect of their business, such as shipping and packaging. So particularly if you're like in the e-commerce market, that's a huge part of your business, you might choose to start there. Then after you've measured the greenhouse gases from either that specific activity or your entire corporate entity, all your owned operations and like vehicles, buildings, all those things can come into it. Next, we want to implement emission reduction strategies in areas that inventory highlighted. So when we do an inventory, not only is there a full report that shows a company like Barriston where their emissions are coming from, but we actually make recommendations for how to lower those emissions. So the idea is that you want to know how much you're emitting, you want to actively try to reduce that, and then you want to offset what is considered unavoidable or difficult to reduce emissions by supporting sustainable projects that ultimately act to reduce and avoid global carbon emissions. So our three major steps: we have to know how much we're emitting, we have to actively try to reduce that, and then offset what is left. So in Barriston becoming carbon neutral, they went through the process of measuring their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which included natural gas and electricity. Just for a really quick background, a Scope 1 emission is considered direct. So Scope 1 emissions are direct sources. So those are from owned or controlled assets. So any buildings that are owned, fleet vehicles, things like that would fall under a company's Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are considered indirect, but come from purchased electricity, steam, or heating and cooling. So of course, Barriston is not creating their own electricity on site, but they are purchasing electricity specifically for the purpose of electrifying their offices. So that is what comes in under Scope 2 emissions. So once the inventory was done, we now know that Barriston's total Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for the 2020 year were 69.24 tons of CO2 equivalency. Also, when we talk about emissions, you might see this metric quite a bit, tons of CO2 equivalency. That actually does encompass all the greenhouse gases. Because carbon is the major one that we talk about, and to make it easier to understand and quantify, all other greenhouse gases have a metric that puts them in a CO2 equivalency, and so we measure it that way. So this is the overall number that encompasses all greenhouse gas emissions. And what we saw from the Barriston inventory specifically, we had about an 85-15% split. So we had 85% of their emissions coming from direct emissions from natural gas, and only 15% coming from indirect emissions from electricity. It is important to point out that this is pretty common for Ontario-based businesses because of the fact that Ontario's electricity grid is pretty clean. There is almost no fossil fuel on the Ontario electricity grid. So generally, if you're a business that's operating in Ontario, the emissions coming from your electricity are going to be fairly low. This would not be the case if you were based in Alberta or Saskatchewan, which again are important things to consider for businesses that potentially have sites in multiple locations. So let's talk about the benefits to becoming carbon neutral. They are far stretching. So any company that moves forward in becoming carbon neutral and has the ability now to make a carbon neutrality claim can experience many benefits. First, the obvious, you've reduced your climate impact to net zero. Super exciting. Everyone feels great about that. But there are many other far-reaching benefits, including identifying those opportunities to reduce emissions. So like I mentioned, once you do the greenhouse gas inventory, you know where all your emissions are coming from, and it can really help to highlight those areas that are going to be important to reduce. When you then go through the process of implementing potentially efficiency projects to reduce those emissions, you can also see reduced costs. So if you are using less natural gas or less electricity, you're definitely going to see less cost as well, which can be an added benefit. It also demonstrates industry leadership. So as Jacqueline had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it really sets you aside from other businesses that play in your same wheelhouse. So if someone is looking for a law office, Barriston has now set themselves aside as a leadership in environmental stewardship, which is really important. It increases corporate social responsibility. It increases employee retention, acquisition, and engagement. And same thing goes for customers. So Jacqueline mentioned this at the beginning as it pertains to Barriston, incredibly important. So especially as younger generations come up into the job market and occupy more of those candidates, people are increasingly more concerned about what companies are doing to mitigate their climate impact. And so not only can it help you retain the employees you have, it is a very important aspect of employee acquisition and keeping those employees engaged over time and really excited about what the company is doing. And the exact same thing applies to customers. So people are looking to be really informed consumers these days, and whether it's supporting a law office or buying a product that's from a company that can say that they're carbon neutral, that's something that really resonates with customers. And lastly, investment in greenhouse gas reduction and avoidance projects also have far-reaching benefits. So aside from all those other benefits, the actual projects that you're supporting have really amazing whole lists of benefits themselves, which we'll get into a little bit later. First, I just want to briefly explain what Carbonzero certification is. So Barriston is now Carbonzero certified for their corporate operations, and they have been issued their own Carbonzero certified mark, as we see here. So this one's a demo, but every company that receives Carbonzero certification for either whole corporate operations or a sector of their business will receive their own unique serialized mark. So this program was developed to assist our clients in declaring carbon neutrality under a structure that maintains a high level of environmental integrity. So because our participants are adhering to stringent emissions measurement methodology performed by our advisory services team, and then also the offset project selection process by our project sourcing and development team. So we know the exact process that anyone who's gone through who can claim Carbonzero certified, or CZC for short. And what plays into this really well, what the mark serves as a jumping off point to look that company up in our registry. So the Carbonzero registry is actually a public search engine or portal, and it can be used by carbon offset certificate holders, clients of CZC, or if you as a consumer or a potential client of somewhere who is making this sort of claim, if you see that they have a CZC mark, you can take the number that we saw on the bottom there and type it into the Carbonzero registry. So this is an example here of a company Fullscript, which is another client of Carbonzero. We type in their number and their information comes up. So The Carbonzero registry is regularly audited, and it ensures that all the carbon offset purchases that are received have that unique serialized number, and they'll be exclusively retired, which prevents any offsets from being resold or reused or anything like that. So it was created in 2010 as a direct effort to improve stakeholder transparency. So any companies that even have stakeholders, this is a great resource for them. And it's not only really accessible, but it's a defensible one-stop shop for an audit trail for any of those offsets that are being purchased. So this is on our website, just carbonzero.ca/registry, and you can check it out. Any CZC marks that you see, you can type them in there and see all the information that you need. So let's talk a little bit more about the carbon offset projects specifically. I've mentioned them a few times, but the projects are really what often gets people super excited because there are some really interesting projects that you can support and feel good about. Something that sets Carbonzero aside is that we are the industry leader in holding Canadian offset projects, which is really important because most of our clients are also Canadian. Canadian businesses typically want to support close to home projects. It feels really good to be making a difference close to where you're potentially having some emissions. So when we talk about Canadian offset projects, there are several different project types. We have afforestation, energy conservation, improved forest management, landfill gas capture, solar energy, wastewater energy. This isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, but does represent the types of projects that we typically have available now. And again, really exciting to be able to support those close to home projects. So these are in several provinces across Canada. Then we also have international offset projects, which Carbonzero is also able to source. And for clients that have larger inventories, often they use a portfolio. So they're actually contributing to several different projects. So it could be a mix of Canadian and international. When we see international offset projects, they're often associated with SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. So the UN outlined these Sustainable Development Goals, and because international projects are often occurring in developing countries, there's a huge potential for a large amount of social co-benefit to be happening in these projects. So there are 17 goals, and anytime that you see a project profile of an international project, you might see several of these SDGs kind of pasted on there to say which of these goals that project helps push forward. And those goals include everything from no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and lastly, partnership for the goals. So really amazing social co-benefits that can happen with these international projects. I did want to highlight a specific project because not only is this project Carbonzero's flagship project, it is also the project that Barriston has chosen to support. So a great one to just have a little highlight on. This is the Niagara Escarpment Forest Carbon Project. It's located right here on Ontario, and it's pretty wide stretching. So the Niagara Escarpment has this forest carbon project stretching all the way from Niagara up onto Manitoulin Island. So it stretches a huge part of Ontario. And the type of project it is both forest protection and improved forest management. This project itself has many exciting benefits. So as I was saying, along with all those other benefits of becoming carbon neutral, you also get to look at all the benefits of the projects you're supporting. So for project highlights for the Niagara Escarpment project specifically, it has mitigated since 2022 more than 50,000 tons of CO2 equivalency. 50,000 tons of CO2 equivalency, sorry. So as I mentioned previously, Barriston's annual emissions for 2020 were only about 69 tons of CO2 equivalency. So this is a massive amount that's been mitigated by this project. It's equivalent to approximately taking 10,874 cars off the road for the entire year. So a pretty exciting metric. And this project seeks to promote and maintain the function and diversity of the ecosystems along the escarpment. This is a really important area for wildlife, and this project is protecting all that forest cover in areas that could be facing pressure otherwise. So there is increased pressure on land and wildlife in these areas from anything from logging, mineral extraction, severances, development, anything like that are pressures that this land could be facing or would be facing, most certainly, if it was not protected otherwise. Protection of species then on this property include pileated woodpeckers, painted turtles, and great gray owls, as well as biodiversity as a whole. So obviously, if you protect a huge tract of land, you're protecting all the species that inhabit it as well, which is a really exciting thing to think about. It fosters land stewardship through that improved land management. And when we have this protected area management, not only does it encourage sustainable low impact recreation, they're creating those opportunities by having nature trail management. So we're creating trails that restrict human activity onto the trails specifically, a very small amount of the area. So it is encouraging that sustainable low impact in recreation, and really protecting all the natural habitats that surround it. I wanted to give a further highlight to the feature species just because I know it's something that people get really excited about, myself included. So this property specifically has feature species including pileated woodpeckers, great gray owls, and painted turtles. And I just wanted to highlight something that's even important right now as we speak, sort of a nature happening. So for turtles specifically, turtles in Ontario really need our help. Actually, all 8 of our species now are considered at risk. And many people think that the important season to be aware of turtles and turtle crossing is May and June when they're nesting, which is true, but right now is actually a time of year where both hatchling turtles and adult turtles are making their way to their wintering grounds. Turtles tend to return to the same grounds every single year. And so any new development or infrastructure that is placed sort of in their way on their general path is just another barrier and challenge for them to try to overcome, and makes it even more hard for them to get to those wintering grounds successfully. So having these large protected areas really is such a help to animals like that they can remain safe within that protected area and make it to next season. So that is it from me. I will hand the baton back to Jacqueline to talk about some potential next steps for Barriston, and then we'll get into some questions.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to jump in here. That was really interesting about turtles. I didn't know that. So as Jacqueline mentioned earlier, my name's Nadine Finbo. I'm a family law lawyer at Barriston. I'm also the chair of our Green Committee as well. So I'm happy to be a part of this today. Carbonzero certification was one of our firm's goals for 2021. And now that we've achieved it, we don't want to lose momentum. We're constantly looking at ways to reduce our carbon footprint and environmental impact, and also to become more sustainable in our business practices. So one of the ways that we're looking at doing that is through employee engagement, but not only with this project, with others as well. With respect to carbon neutrality, we're looking at ways to get our employees involved in actively reducing their carbon footprint at work and at home. And we're excited about the level of interest and engagement that we have already had with those efforts. Jacqueline mentioned earlier that we've had a number of employees start looking at how to obtain residential carbon neutrality, but there's also been a lot of interest in how to reduce your individual carbon footprints as well. Another way we're looking at continually reducing our environmental impact is through digitization and efforts to become paperless. The legal industry does present some challenges in going paperless. However, we're making every effort to get to that point. Not only has digitization been an ongoing project to reduce our environmental impact, it's also had the added benefit of increasing efficiency and productivity. A great example of that was how efficient it was to transition to working remotely. Looking towards 2022, our Green Committee is looking to focus on waste reduction across our offices. There are some unique challenges for businesses with respect to waste reduction, but luckily there's also some unique solutions. One thing I truly appreciate about Barriston is that we have a culture of teamwork, and because of that, I know we'll continue to find ways to reduce our environmental impact. So, thank you. I believe I'll turn it back over to Mackenzie.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. I learned so much, and I'm just going to pull up some of the questions that we have from our participants here, because we did have quite a few. And so if I could start by think we're going to kick it off to the carbon neutral team. And we have a question as it relates to agriculture. So one second here. Are you aware of any incentives for the agriculture industry to adopt more regenerative techniques in producing food, such as no-till and managed grazing? This is a very specific question, so I'm assuming this person who asked is a part of that industry and is interested in learning more. So if I could kick it off to perhaps the carbon neutral team to answer that.
Yeah, definitely. Dan, did you want to comment, or I can go ahead?
I get my camera back on here. Hi, folks. Yeah, I mean, well, this is a little bit outside of our wheelhouse. You know, the development of a carbon offset project around regenerative agriculture could provide financial incentives to farmers, but there's not currently any projects like that in Ontario that provide that kind of incentive. So as I said, it's more outside our wheelhouse, but in general, I understand there may be funding available on regional, provincial, and national levels. A group that performed a regenerative program and incentives feasibility study in about 2019, 2020 is called the Organic Council of Ontario. We can send some links around after the webinar, but they may be worth looking into. We're not sure if they provide funding directly, but they have spent some time looking into it. It might be a good place to start. So we can send around those links after the meeting.
Amazing. The next question we have here is, what does the process of assessing a company's carbon footprint look like?
Sure, I can jump in there. This is Liam at Carbonzero. I think Heather did a pretty nice job of summarizing it during the presentation, but just in the context of setting up an inventory, usually what we first do in a greenhouse gas inventory project is, set up the boundaries of what we're looking at. And for an organization of any size, what that comes down to is going through a process to determine the materiality or the significance of all of the emission sources. So what we're trying to do basically through that initial exercise is determine what's worth including, where do we anticipate having data collection challenges, and through that exercise, we're focusing on just setting up the entire scope of the project. Once we have that done, it's really a data collection exercise. We pick a reporting period, often a calendar year or fiscal year. And from there, it's all about going after all of the inputs that drive the emissions quantification. Once all that data is collected, our team comes back and calculates the emissions from each particular activity and provides a report to that organization. Oftentimes, that report forms a baseline or a formal baseline year for a target or a reduction strategy. So once that exercise is complete, it opens up the door to future reductions and future plans.
So typically, how long does that process actually take? Does it depend on the company or the organization, or what is there? Is it really differing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does vary. As everyone can appreciate with supply chains and suppliers and customers, when you get into some of the more complicated supply chain and value chain based emission sources, you may be asking for data from certain vendors, certain customers about how products are purchased and used. But in a typical sense, a standard inventory for, a mid-sized Ontario business usually takes in the neighborhood of, 4 to 10 weeks, depending on how available that data is. But scope, particularly with indirect emission sources, is really the driver of how long a project can take and how familiar the organization is with respect to what data is required. So certain organizations we work with have a robust data management system. They manage and measure everything under the sun. Whereas other organizations are approaching this more from an inexperienced perspective. They may not have all of their utility data stored. They may have to be going through financial records to pull a lot of this stuff out. So it really just depends on the organization.
Awesome. That's really helpful. Thank you. The next question we have here is, what is the biggest hurdle companies need to clear when transitioning their business to a more carbon neutral / environmentally friendly practices?
Yeah, I can jump in there as well. And Heather and Dan, feel free to chime in too. Usually, I think the primary barrier that we hear from clients, not necessarily ones that we identify, but that we're hearing from clients, is that they don't know where to start. Is a common line that we hear about. I think the hesitancy and the apprehension about completing a greenhouse gas inventory for the purpose of benefiting your organization or becoming carbon neutral one day, the primary roadblock where that comes from is not knowing what data they will need. What we often find ourselves telling clients and groups that we're about to work with is that a lot of the data that you need, you probably already have. You may not know where it is, you may not know the value behind it, but a lot of that data already exists. And we're talking utility bills for things like natural gas and electricity. We're talking maintenance records for refrigerant top-ups if you're in more of an industrial application. Typical financial records that tell the story of a travel manifest of a particular business. So a lot of that data is accessible, though I think it does get identified as a barrier. And then for organizations that are maybe a little bit further along in the process as far as implementing a reduction strategy, I think there's always a little bit of a line in the sand when organizations really have to commit dollars to achieving emissions reductions, whether that's a small scale energy project where you're getting off of natural gas and potentially electrifying the building, which will of course add operational costs but significantly reduce emissions. I think the other barrier is really just coming to terms with the meaningful investment dollars funding emissions reduction is kind of another turning point or barrier for some.
Those are great points. Thank you. How does transportation for employees to and from work and/or meetings get weighed when we talk about a business becoming carbon neutral?
Yeah, so as Heather mentioned, when we perform a greenhouse gas inventory, we're following emissions categorization rules that are set out by what's referred to as the GHG protocol, which is essentially the rule book for performing greenhouse gas inventories in a business environment. So scope one, as Heather mentioned, are direct, often combustion sources, natural gas within a building. It also includes things like fugitive emissions from leakages in industrial systems on refrigerants. Scope two is all about electricity and steam and chilled water. But for most folks in Ontario, it's primarily electricity, unless you're in downtown Toronto. And then scope three, the lazy answer would be it covers everything else. But the true answer is that scope three emissions describe carbon and other greenhouse gas releases that are caused by the business, but are from activities that the business doesn't actually own or control. So employee commuting is, a perfect example of that. When people are coming to work every day or 5 days a week or 3 days a week, whatever it may be, if they're driving a car, an average car in North America produces about 250 grams of CO2 per kilometer that it's driven. Those emissions would be categorized as a scope three. Now, of course, COVID has introduced some impacts towards materiality, and a number of organizations that we've worked with on 2020 inventories haven't brought in employee commuting simply because so many employees were remote for most of the year. So it wasn't something that we dealt with a lot in 2020, but it's absolutely a common reporting category and one that's worth measuring, because when you think about it in very practical terms, if you have a large proportion of your organization that drives to work every day when transit is available, there's pretty direct lineage as far as incentivizing or encouraging emissions reductions through commuting. To the point where an organization may consider, paying for a parking pass or for a bus pass instead of a parking pass for that employee to incentivize some of those behavior changes that are going to help the organization reduce emissions.
Awesome. That's a really helpful answer. Thanks, Liam. the next question we have here, how often do companies have to get recertified by Carbonzero, and what does that recertification process look like?
Yeah, so it's for most organizations, it's an annual undertaking. A lot of the groups that we work with are operating within some form of greenhouse gas measurement or reduction strategy or plan. What that means for a lot of those groups is they're really trying to monitor what the results are of their inventory each and every year. So as far as declaring carbon neutrality, whether that's through our organization, whether that's through another organization or without a third party to back it up, the claim is generally made for a period, for a specified period, usually for a year. As far as, product specific carbon neutrality claims, if you read about a carbon neutral product, that would specify a very similar scope, and that the production run for a period of time or for a set number of units would have been assessed as carbon neutral. But for us, most organizations that we work with come back each and every year and wrap up the greenhouse gas inventory project on an annual basis.
Awesome, it's good to know. There's somebody else, I guess this question kind of falls similarly to the certification, but how does Carbonzero ensure a company doesn't change its practice and greenwash its practices or produce false data just to keep the mark of the certification?
Yeah, so when we do greenhouse gas inventories, there's a certain validation requirement. So in the context of, for example, the Barriston inventory, we review bills, we review financial statements, we review from within the utilities portal, making sure that data lines up. So when we do an inventory, we provide a data quality assessment on each of the activities that we're bringing into the inventory. And when data quality is below a certain threshold, that data, for one, simply would not be used. But we do provide recommendations in order to improve data quality when certain, adjustments to the data have to be made, whether you're a small business operating in a larger building, so you have to determine your own utilities via pro rata consumption, for example, as opposed to being sub-metered. So we do provide recommendations as far as how to improve the data, but in the vast majority of our projects, we're performing some level of validation as far as looking at a sample of receipts, a sample of invoices, utility bills, that kind of thing.
There's two questions here surrounding kind of carbon neutrality at home and how, one, what can individuals do to move toward carbon neutrality at home? And then obviously if you're working from home, how do you calculate your business carbon footprint?
Yeah, and feel free to jump in, anyone, but the latter question about calculating your footprint at home, that's virtual or remote based work was a scope 3 category that sort of showed up a little bit more because of COVID. To be perfectly candid, it's very difficult to get high quality data for measuring this. What this effectively involves is asking, staff and stakeholders, board members, that kind of thing, to provide home-based utility data. It's, at scale, that's obviously a difficult task to do, but there are ways to, through the use of provincial or municipal specific energy benchmarks, to provide an estimate of what the footprint would likely be. Of course, then you have to allocate a certain amount of emissions to just the workstation, right? We're not necessarily concerned about what's going on in the kitchen or the basement. We're really focused on what's going on in the office. As far as reducing emissions at home, though, I think it really depends where you live, how you live your life, the types of activities that you participate in. In Ontario, as Heather mentioned, we're blessed with a relatively clean electricity grid that primarily, fluctuates in the summer and the coldest days of the winter to bring on additional natural gas, which is of course a fossil fuel, but the base load is primarily met with nuclear and hydro, which are non-emissions generating sources. So as far as emissions reductions at home. A lot of the time it's focusing on things like your vehicle. If you're not driving an electric vehicle, it's focusing on conventional natural gas furnaces that of course use fossil fuels for home heating. And I think another area that sometimes gets overlooked is playing within the rules of your green bin program. So making sure that you're using it as best as you can. Certain residences have challenges as far as condos and having some options available to them. But if you have a green bin program, that's certainly another place to look.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in quickly here and just mention a few sort of lifestyle aspects as well. We always do want to acknowledge firstly that most emissions do come from large corporations and not necessarily individuals, but I do think it's incredibly important to be conscious of the impact that we're having on the world and make our decisions accordingly. So I would just say that it really comes down to making choices that directly associate with lighter emissions being put out into the world. Even like I mentioned for the Niagara Escarpment Carbon Forest project, that encourages low impact recreation, which are activities like hiking or canoeing, things that actually are not emissions producing activities. So if you think about winter even coming up, sorry to mention, but winter is coming up and some people's main activities might include things like snowmobiling or things like that. I'm not saying never snowmobile again, but maybe take up snowshoeing as well. Have those activities that you do that have very little to no impact, and just be really conscious of your decisions in general. Buying close to home matters. Reducing red meat consumption is huge for CO2 emissions. All these little things matter, as well as how you're using utilities in your home.
For anybody who might be interested and wants to measure their personal emissions or home emissions, we do have a calculator on our website at carbonzero.ca that you can measure your utilities, vehicles, flights when you start taking them again, and ground travel as well. So I invite any of the attendees to come and check it out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for mentioning that, Deanna. Somebody actually had also asked the question, any advice on starting on where to start, how to measure and monitor, and best information, best places to get information like this. So I'll definitely be sending that link so people can immediately go and check that process out. And those were great tips, even that you provided, Heather and Liam, for starting off for these people that are wanting to. Ooh, yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Curtis. Put it in there. Amazing.
I'll just quickly add too, under that realm, in terms of people potentially wanting to calculate what like their home office is, there is an option there to calculate by square footage. So if you know the office space that you use in your home, you can actually calculate that as well. So yeah, great tool to calculate either your overall personal footprint or your kind of work from home footprint, and actively work towards reducing that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I just wanted to quickly shift. I know we have a couple more questions left, but just over to Barriston's perspective, because I know that in the chat, Barriston said that the Carbonzero team helped us know what information was best to provide them, and also in some cases, how to find it. They made the process a smooth one, and it helped us understand areas that we can improve on. And I know obviously becoming B Corp was a massive undertaking first that your offices ventured out on, but then getting onto wanting to become carbon neutral, maybe you could explain any challenges or preconceived challenges you had, like going into the process, any hurdles that you had to take over in order to actually become carbon neutral now. Was there any further insight that you could kind of give to our audience to know that maybe it's not as hard as you may think it is, or it is, and you got to keep going, kind of thing? Any other information, Jacqueline or Nadine, you could touch on, that'd be awesome.
I can jump in here. So going through the B Corp certification process versus the Carbonzero certification process, I think Jacqueline would agree with me that the Carbonzero certification process was it was much easier than B Corp certification. B Corp certification is oftentimes confusing, and you need a lot of hand-holding. We did get a lot of hand-holding from Carbonzero, which was great, but the team at Carbonzero, they knew exactly what they needed from us and provided us with ways to find it. So it was a very streamlined process in my experience.
I think it's important to note too that it was almost presented to us like a pipe dream. It was something that we had thought about doing. We were like, hey, there's an option. We could potentially become carbon neutral. And we thought it was a little bit far-fetched because it seems like a really big undertaking. And so we reached out and we just, we talked to Carbonzero. We said, what does this look like? Is this achievable? Is this something we can do? If it is something that's achievable, is it affordable? And the answer to everything was yes. It was so easy. It was, obviously work is involved. You need to get the documents to them. You need to assess things. It's an undertaking, but it's a straightforward undertaking. It's something that they tell you exactly what you need. And there were several times that we said, are we looking for this or do we need this specifically? And they were always there to answer our questions. And like I said, it ended up being quite a bit more affordable than we had originally anticipated. So we really have been thrilled with the process from beginning to, I won't say end because it's an ongoing process, but from beginning to certification, we at Barriston have been thrilled with Carbonzero and are really excited to continue to work with them.
That's awesome. That's a really helpful perspective to have. And I just wanted to get back to you guys before we kind of finished off with a couple more questions here, because I know having that insight and perspective is really helpful, I think, for others who are trying to think about whether they want to engage and continue down this path. And somebody actually is asking, isn't carbon offsetting expensive? How is it possible to make a business case? So perhaps the Carbonzero team could touch on that for somebody who's maybe wanting to bring it forward into their company, but they're kind of doubtful or intimidated perhaps.
Yeah, carbon offsetting, certainly is an evolution of how carbon has, traditionally been treated on the balance sheet for a lot of organizations. You look 5 to 10 years ago, particularly within, the financial sector or, oil and gas, you would price in carbon into your company financials as a way to just say, this is the price of carbon we eventually plan for. Now, what carbon offsetting can do is bring in a lot of those same principles, but really get a net emissions reduction on a per ton basis through doing largely a similar financial exercise. So in terms of, is it expensive? Of course, for heavy emitters, it's absolutely a very expensive exercise. And that's, why when you look at those heavy emitting industries, so we're talking heavy industry, primary consumers of fossil fuels, offsetting isn't necessarily the first line of defense. And frankly, it shouldn't be, because for those organizations, high intensity producers of emissions, the focus should be on reducing emissions. And that's really the forefront activity for many organizations, because you want to be able to reduce and then offset the rest. I think where the affordability aspect comes into play and is a little bit better understood is that if an organization or a leadership team or a board has committed to achieving carbon neutrality, what it does is it really incentivizes the future emissions reductions in the future. Because if internally, we have made a financial commitment to achieving carbon neutrality, it really helps to drive the costs down across the organization, because that you're committed to this exercise. So, offsets are priced at, some are very expensive, but the general cost for a carbon offset within Canada is between, $25 and $35 per ton. When you drive a car for 1 year, basically 20,000 kilometers, you're probably going to be in the 4 or 5 ton range. So just as a general equivalency, but as far as costs for small to medium-sized enterprises, offsetting in addition to a reduction strategy can usually be handled by many organizations.
That's helpful. Thank you.
And I'll just jump in quickly just to highlight that it definitely scales, right? So like Liam was mentioning, for larger companies that have large emissions that are difficult to mitigate just because of how much space they occupy and how many employees they have, et cetera, it's going to be a large company with larger amount of emissions and therefore a larger expense. But as we saw with Barriston, their emissions are relatively low. They're a small business, of course, small to medium-sized business. So we definitely see that scaling across. And then even as it comes into personal, because I know that several people on here are interested in that. So at the prices that Liam outlined, like if we're sitting at like $20 to $30, $35 per ton in Canada for those offset projects, a round trip economy flight from Toronto to Vancouver is approximately 1 ton. And so if you took that trip and then you wanted to offset your own flight, just personally, I want to make sure that I'm doing something to support a project if I'm going to take this flight either way. That's only going to cost you around that mark. So $20 to $35 for that 1 ton of your flight emissions. So it is pretty reasonable in that sense, especially on those personal levels as well.
Perfect. That's great to know. And actually following that, somebody's asking, can any business become carbon neutral, or are there specific requirements? So business size, e-commerce or not, international example, or et cetera, sorry. So obviously I don't think there is, but if you guys could touch on if there are specific requirements to becoming carbon neutral, that would be awesome.
Yeah, generally it's a fairly open-ended playing field as far as who can make a carbon neutrality claim. As far as the diversity of businesses, organizations that have made carbon neutrality commitments, carbon neutral claims, net zero commitments, they come in all different shapes and sizes. It is highly diverse. I think, there are some key exceptions as to, where the claim doesn't necessarily make a tremendous amount of sense. Obviously, we're speaking to, certain oil and gas producers. We're speaking to, some primary generators of emissions. At the end of the day, for a lot of businesses, whether you're small, whether you're mid, whether you're large, there are emissions that are associated with the business. We work with organizations that frankly don't have any scope 1 and 2 emissions because all they do is lease space. They don't have any operationally controlled assets. So, that would be on the small side, but of course there are, massive organizations who have gone out and made carbon neutrality claims. So I would say it's generally open-ended, but I think that there are some industries that perhaps their customers or the general community wouldn't perhaps respond as well to if a claim were to be made.
That's helpful, thank you. And we have one last question here. We do have time, about maybe a couple more minutes if anybody has some on their mind that they'd like to pop in there quick. But somebody's actually interested in your backgrounds. What brought you to this business, and is there an educational component that they're asking for their kids?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I started with Carbonzero in about 2012, 2013. My background's in environmental studies. I have a postgrad in environmental management, where carbon, was one of a few courses that were discussed at the time. Back then, just found it to be among the more practical, pragmatic areas for business and sustainability to come together. So that's kind of how I came in it. I've done sustainability coordinator roles in the past, but at the end of the day, my passion and focus has really always been on business and carbon related metrics.
Awesome. Heather, how about you? Yeah, or Dan.
That's right. I've been with Carbonzero going on my 14th year right now, and I wasn't necessarily I didn't go to school for environment or anything like that. I think most of what I learned about it, I've learned over the past 14 years. But I think before that, I was more of an environmentalist, and so caring about the environment is an important element of our business, and helping our clients, make the right steps. So yeah, you certainly get into it. You don't necessarily have to have a big education background. I'm more on the business side of things. But if you want to get into quantification, do the kind of work that Liam and his team does, there's a lot of great schools in Ontario that are available for that. I'm sure Liam can share a few of those offline as well.
Yeah, and then for me, My background is not necessarily entirely environmental. I actually have a Bachelor of Science in Zoology, which is why I want to bring in little turtle facts.
Love it.
And then I did a Master's of Environmental Studies. I specifically focused on using education to mitigate conflicts that happen between humans and wildlife, but just it occupied a lot of environmental education roles and became really focused and interested on communicating environmental information, educating the general public about these sorts of things. So yeah, it just kind of moved on to more education-based roles, and now I'm in a communications lead role at Carbonzero. So yeah, that's really kind of not straightforward, but yeah.
It's awesome. I love the diversity and the different paths for your backgrounds. And I know, Jacqueline, your background is interesting too, because I mean, the other day we were talking about how you were able to bring your passion from your education and your minor into the work that you do now with Barriston. So perhaps you could give me a quick background on you as well.
Yeah, I actually, I studied environmental studies in my undergrad degree. So unfortunately, it doesn't play into my day-to-day work life all that often. So it was really nice when this opportunity was presented. So I don't think I said at the beginning of the presentation, but I'm chair of our B Corp committee. So green aspects are certainly a consideration in the B Corp certification and recertification process. So I was able to consider it as part of that. And then Nadine obviously came in from the Green Committee perspective. And it was really exciting for both of us that we were able to pull in that passion to also to improve this business for the people that work here, for the people that that hire our services. I'm really glad to have been able to be part of this and pull the environment into Barriston.
Yeah, that's super exciting. And I mean, as a Sandbox, as partners, we're so excited to be able to support businesses in our region with providing access to even Barriston as a resource to knowing all the things when it comes to B Corp and now carbon neutrality. So I know in the chat here, I didn't want to miss it. Barriston did mention for another case for spending the money on becoming carbon neutral for those that are maybe wanting some more information. The cost of recruitment is very high. We know that for people are more likely to stay at a business that they share values with. So by engaging in initiatives like carbon neutrality, it can actually act as an attraction and retention tool, which I think is a great point for bringing up. So thank you. That, I believe, brings us to the end of our questions. We did have one last question: what does it mean to be carbon neutral? But I feel like everybody should know this question by now. So thank you everyone for being here today. Jacqueline, Nadine from Barriston, Dan, Liam, and Heather, we so appreciate your time this morning. And it was, I know I'm walking away with so much more information than I started with here. So really appreciate you guys being here today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So just another huge thank you to our partners, Barriston Law, for supporting the delivery of today's session. Registrants who obviously couldn't attend this session will definitely be provided a link to the recording, and all the additional resources from Carbonzero that they mentioned today will be providing you afterwards. So keep an eye on your email. Sandbox has multiple resources available to you, as well as access to a community designed to help you create a better life through business and build life-enhancing connections. So we encourage you to stay connected with us on social at Sandbox Center, or head over to our website, sandboxcenter.com, for more details. Also, stay in touch with Carbonzero and Barriston on socials as well. They're doing amazing things in their communities and across the country as a whole. So thank you again, everybody. We wish you a wonderful day ahead and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.